Hello, students, and welcome to class. Today, we are in a very scenic environment. Behind me is the Bodhi tree, also called the peepal tree, a tree that's sacred to many Asian religions. And for Buddhism, it's the tree under which Siddhartha will become the Buddha. And the night in which Siddhartha becomes the Buddha was the night of a full moon. Well, so what happened on that full moon night? Well, Siddhartha becomes the awakened one. In an earlier lecture, we saw how Siddhartha becomes awakened to his previous lives as a bodhisattva, a Buddha in training. We find these stories in the Jataka tales. Last lecture, we saw how the Buddha would envision this cycle of birth and death, this cycle of reincarnation called samsara. In today's lecture, we're going to go into the final phase of the moon, and that is where the Buddha will see the Dharma, the path leading out of cyclic existence. In many cultures, especially where Buddhism is prevalent, the full moon night, usually that's the 15th of the lunar month. It's a very special day. Buddhists do many prayers. Buddhists believe this is a time where if you want to accumulate good karma, your karma is amplified. Many places, eating meat or drinking alcohol will be forbidden. So the full moon night is very special in many Buddhist countries and cultures, because that's under a full moon that the Buddha obtains his enlightenment. All right, and we are going to break out of jail. Our last class we were in jail. Now we're going to break out. How are we going to break out of jail, you might wonder? Well, we're going to saw through the bars of jail with our 3 jewels. Now let's back up to the life of Siddhartha. As we can recall, Siddhartha was a noble prince who had a life of luxury till he saw old age, sickness, and death. Images that would haunt the prince, that would inspire the prince also to leave and to go off into the forest. This inspiration becomes especially important after he meets or he sees a vision of a holy wanderer, the Sanskrit term called a shramana, a wanderer, a seeker. So Siddhartha is a seeker, seeking how does one escape this endless cycle of old age, sickness, and death. Well, we're going to see he will realize that, he'll figure out the answer. And in a metaphoric, not a literal sense, he will go from becoming a prince to becoming a doctor. Let's take a look at Dr. Buddha, everyone. So how is the Buddha a doctor? Well, this comes down to the 3 jewels. There's many traditions of Buddhism and many different cultures in which you find Buddhism, and a lot of diversity within Buddhism. But all the Buddhist traditions have perhaps at least one thing in common, and this idea that there are 3 precious jewels, not actual jewels like a diamond or a sapphire or a ruby, but even more precious according to Buddhism. These are the jewels that we as ordinary people can use, can turn to, can take refuge under, that will prevent us from being born in these lower realms of rebirth, like the hell realm, the hungry ghost realm, or the animal realm. Well, what are the 3 jewels? 3 jewels are said to also be the cure. the cure for suffering. So there's 3 parts to the cure. First, when you're sick, you go to somebody who understands, who can diagnose your ailments and give you the required medicine. Well, that is the Buddha. The Buddha is an enlightened teacher and is often viewed as the ultimate doctor. He's able to diagnose and give you the treatments that an individual needs to overcome the problem of samsara, the cycle of birth and death, the problem of being under the control and sway of karma, and the problems of old age, sickness, and death, and all forms of suffering that we encounter. The Buddha will give a pill for that, but it is the pill. The pill comes in the form of a path, and that path we call the Dharma. This is the supreme teachings, the Four Noble Truths, and this is the absolute medicine. But it's up to the individual whether or not they want to take the medicine. The Buddha doesn't actually cure an individual per se, but rather gives the medicine for individuals to cure themselves. And that medicine, again, is the Dharma. As we'll see later in the semester, well, after this figure of the Buddha disappears from the world, what is left is a community that will try to maintain the teachings, maintain the sacred medicine that is the Dharma, and to keep the legacy of the Buddha alive. And this is our final jewel. This is a Sangha. The Sangha is most often described in Buddhism as the community of monks and nuns. It's a community of monks and nuns, and this is kind of like the nursing and healing staff of a hospital. So again, this is all about the jailbreak. The Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, this is the healing system, the healing mechanism, the healing infrastructure, the doctor, the medicine, and the hospital, and the caregivers, and the nurses that are going to permanently eliminate suffering by getting rid of these underlying conditions, the condition of greed, or raga, hatred or anger, dvesha, and ignorance or moha. The 3 jewels are the treatment system, the healing system for blowing out these 3 poisons. And by blowing out these 3 poisons, the engine of cyclic existence, of samsara, comes to an end. And this is our ultimate goal. This is the state of nirvana. This is freedom from negative karma, freedom from cyclic existence and samsara. All right, let's take a look here. So the 3 watches, we saw the karmalogical, the previous lives of the Buddha as found in the Jataka tales, the cosmological, the cycle that we looked at last lecture. Now we're going to look a little bit closer at this dharmalogical, where the teachings, the path of the Dharma, this becomes where the Buddha is fully awakened. He sees that path where everyone can escape old age, suffering, and death. And all right, and so it's the 3rd watch. This is the watch where the Buddha will see the Dharma, the pathway out of suffering. He gives this first teaching at a place called Sarnath in India, modern day India, where he will describe the Dharma to a group of students. These students are a group of ascetics who abandoned Siddhartha when Siddhartha ate food after starving himself. He'll teach them this path out of samsara, the key to obtaining nirvana. And these are our 4 noble truths. Our first noble truth is the truth of suffering, that life is suffering. And this is a very different presupposition, a very different way of looking at ourselves and our relationship to the world. The default state of existence for all of us, according to Buddhism, and our relationship to the world and the relationship to our friends, our loved ones, and our enemies, it's all the same. The default state where one is not awakened, this default is suffering. So to suffer this is not abnormal in Buddhism. This is the normal state of affairs. It's abnormal only because we are trapped and we can get ourselves untrapped. So this is the truth of the origins of suffering. The cause of suffering, viewed as really twofold things that are combined. We have these insatiable desires for money, wealth, food, comfort, relationships, whatever it might be. Well, why? Why do we have those desires? According to Buddhism, is because we're ignorant. We don't realize that those things are actually going to lead us to suffering and down the path of suffering. Buddhism does not leave us in a state of suffering, because if somebody can know the causes and then know, which are again desire and ignorance, and know how then it's possible to get rid of those causes. If suffering had no cause, it just kind of existed, well, then you're stuck. But if there's things that are causing suffering, i.e. desire and ignorance, anger, the three poisons, if one can get rid of those, one can arrive at a state free of suffering, and that's called nirvana. All right, so the Buddha would realize that such a state does exist, and then most importantly would show the path. This is the truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering, often called the Eightfold Path, which can be broken down into three main parts. Each is intertwined and indispensable. First is morality. The second is, which really entails not harming others. Meditation, which different techniques of training the mind, and then wisdom, understanding reality as Siddhartha did, and understanding the causes of suffering as Siddhartha did. Well, thus to become the Buddha. All right, the first noble truth. So this is the big claim. Life is suffering. Well, suffering has three types. The first is suffering of suffering, dukkha dukkha. Suffering of suffering is anything that one could recognize as suffering. A little bit of a toothache, that's a form of suffering. If anyone's ever broken a bone, that's a form of suffering. If anyone's ever felt bored or anxious or just mentally not at ease, that's suffering. And Buddhism, so long as we are not enlightened, so long as we are trapped in samsara, that's just how we exist. The other is suffering of change. Well, you could say, well, there are things I can think of that bring me happiness. You know, what are some things that bring us happiness? Well, we have our cars. You know, it's nice to have a car until your car breaks down. Our bodies, maybe sometimes we feel comfortable, but our bodies age over time. They're susceptible to sickness and illness. Relationships, well, all relationships sooner or later will come to an end, whether it's because of, human decisions or death. This is called the suffering of change in Buddhism. The things that are bringing us happiness, or we think are bringing us happiness, are actually planting the seeds of suffering. They're setting us up for suffering. One example is, it's kind of like if you're carrying a really heavy burden on one shoulder and your shoulder's starting to hurt. So you put that burden on the other shoulder, and then your shoulder here feels okay, but then this shoulder starts to hurt. That's kind of what it is. We're going from one thing that we think is going to bring us pleasure, but is really setting us up for suffering, to another thing. That's our way of acting and behaving in the world. And then the all-pervasive suffering. This is called the suffering as formation. This is samskara, dukkha. The very universe, because the universe is this that we exist in is a cycle of birth and death, a cycle of old age, sickness, and death, a cycle in which our emotions overwhelm us and prompt us to act in ways often that create negative karma. The whole system is designed to perpetuate and create suffering. That's the universe we live in, so long as we are unenlightened. All right, this is one of my old childhood heroes, Homer Simpson, and he's going to take us through the first noble truth. We'll thank him for coming to today's class. He's going to illustrate each of these forms of suffering. So the suffering of suffering is anything that we think is suffering: getting bit by wolves, or getting in a car crash, or feeling this sort of state of mental unease. And that's our default. That's things that we would recognize as suffering, that we will experience often throughout our existence. Not just often, but in many ways, always. And that's the other thing, is the suffering of change. Things that bring us ease and happiness are setting us up for suffering. All right, well, here we have an example of Homer enjoying a donut and a nice glass of, I think, root beer. And he's having a good time. Or is he? Is Homer really having a good time? The suffering of change. So the things that once brought us happiness are creating the conditions of suffering. We can think of intoxicants as an example of this. We can think of going to a nice buffet and eating really yummy food, but you keep eating, then your stomach it's full, and you get sick and tired later on. So everything that brings us happiness has the nature of suffering. Well, so long as the basis of our happiness is things external to us. And then there's the all-pervasive suffering, or the suffering as formation. This is, again, just the universe, the 6 realms, karma. The world is not designed by any creator in Buddhism and the Buddhist idea to give us happiness and pleasure. Rather, as we learn, the worlds come into existence because of actions of beings. More precisely, often negative actions. And existence in this wheel, this trap, is set up to make us suffer again and again and again. All right, and then one classic story is the story of Kissa Gotami, a mother who gives birth to a child. The mother is very, very happy and full of happiness. Then the child dies. She goes to the Buddha and asks the Buddha, hey, can you bring back my child? And the Buddha says, yes, I will. But you just have to do one thing. I need one ingredient, and that is a mustard seed. So a mustard seed, simple ingredient, but not just any mustard seed. The mustard seed from a family that's never experienced death. So Kissa runs around with her dead child in hand looking for this mustard seed, but every family that she goes to had experienced death and loss. It's then that she realized that death and loss will overcome all, and she's able to overcome her attachment to her child. So looking at suffering in this story, the first form of suffering is, well, just a grieving mother who's lost her child. The second is a brief period of time where Kissa is with her newborn, and she thinks she's happy, but that happiness is forming attachment to a being that's going to pass away. And this leads us to the third form of suffering. The being is going to pass away because our universe is pervaded by old age, sickness, and death. All right, and the second noble truth, why are we trapped in samsara? Why are we trapped under the power of karma? Well, that's because of the origins of suffering. And the origins of suffering, again, this is craving that arises out of ignorance. Well, what do we want? What do you want? What do I want? Buddhism classifies desire into three categories, three types of craving. Craving for sensual pleasure, the pleasure of the senses. So good food, good drinks, physical companionship, a luxurious, comfortable mattress. The craving for existence. So we crave to be famous, to be known, to have power. Craving for non-existence. We want things that exist in the world that to not exist. We come to hate those things, to have anger because of it. Let's take a look. So we can just think of the craving for sensual pleasure, whether it's a fine drink, a taste, good music, viewing, something stimulating. All of these are ultimately fleeting pleasures that leave us unsatisfied but also leave us attached to the things of the senses and thus wanting to find happiness externally, which according to Buddhism and many, many traditions besides Buddhism is not possible. It's not possible to find an everlasting happiness externally. One has to find this happiness within. The craving for existence, for fame and fortune, to look a certain way, to have a certain type of body, to meet certain standards, to feel accepted. So we crave things that are, again, external and thus not going to lead to everlasting happiness. Craving for non-existence, we got things that make us annoyed, bills. I got some of those, a lot of those actually. Homework, telemarketers. I keep getting a call from a telemarketer. They want to extend a warranty on my car that doesn't exist. Why do they keep calling me? It annoys me. Well, I don't want these things to exist. And the craving for them not to exist creates this anger, this hatred. And that's just because we're stuck in samsara. We're stuck in a trap. We're stuck in the trap of karma and rebirth. We keep spinning and spinning our wheels in this cycle because we have these three poisons of greed, hatred, and ignorance. These are the causes of suffering. But suffering in Buddhism is ultimately self-induced. If it's self-induced, it's a mental state, the assumption is it's possible to overcome it via our own inner capacities. We can use the power of our mind to transform our mind such that we're not governed by these three poisons. The third noble truth is it is possible to achieve this state of freedom from suffering. And this is what we call nirvana, the cessation. It's a state of everlasting peace and freedom. And it's the blowing out of the three poisons. It's the end of all karma, but especially negative karma. And again, it's blowing out or extinguishing, kind of like you blow out candles on a birthday cake. But here it's the blowing out of these three things, these three poisons that exist within our mind and keep us trapped in the cycle of old age, sickness, and death from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime in one of these six realms. Now, the fourth noble truth is that there is a path to take to escape, a path to blowing out the three poisons, a path to the states of nirvana. This is the eightfold path. For the sake of simplicity, it really can think of the eightfold path as three main components. One is mental development. This is meditation and practices of mindfulness, which we'll learn about later in the semester. Ethical conduct, which is really not harming others through our speech, our actions, or our livelihood. And then wisdom, a proper understanding of reality and the proper intentions in life to overcome these three poisons. These three are the path. They're inseparable components of the cure, the path out of suffering, the path to nirvana, the freedom, the jailbreak that we have been looking for. And this goes to what we talked about last lecture, that if we can control our emotions through the control of the mind, we can take control of our karma. Well, how do you control the mind? How do you control the emotions? Through these three things: through living a moral lifestyle, through engaging in practices of cultivating the mind or meditation, and through having the right view and understanding of suffering, of who we truly are, and how does one find true freedom from suffering. So morality, meditation, and wisdom enables the control of the emotions, especially those three destructive emotions that we've been talking about. That allows us to control our mind and allows us to control but ultimately overcome our karma through eradicating these three poisons. Morality, meditation, and wisdom, the three major components of the Eightfold Path. That is jailbreak. All right, as we escape our jail, under the full moon nights, under the Bodhi tree, this is how Siddhartha escapes the jail, by mastering that Eightfold Path, by having traveled on the Eightfold Path, and he becomes a Buddha. Siddhartha goes from being a prince who perfected himself over the span of many lifetimes, to becoming an awakened one. And remember, what do we mean by awakened one? He's awakened to the memories of his past lives. He's awakened to how the cycle of birth and death, the cycle that's called samsara, is driven by karma. And finally, he's awakened to the path leading to the end of samsara, the path that comprises of morality, meditation, and wisdom. Okay, so next lecture we'll go more into this path, and we'll begin looking at some of the followers of the Buddha. And over the course of the semester, we'll look at some different traditions that emerge out of Buddhism in different cultural contexts. Okay, and as always, stay safe, stay well, and stay tuned.